Hello, dear viewers, and welcome to the Anti-Wehraboo-Aktion Mini-Episode. It's intended to be a sort of stopgap between the first episode published in 2021 and the second episode in the series which I'm currently working on. Some of you might have already seen the teaser trailer for that, and I wanted to give you something to hopefully tide you over until the second episode is actually done. When you think about it, you could basically call this an Anti-Wehraboo episode in its own right, but without all the memes and visual jokes. If that's a problem, here are a few seconds of some jingling keys with World War II tanks and planes. Oh, hey, look at that. Wow, what fun. Seriously though, I know it's been a long time. I started work on the second episode not long after the first was released and actually got my channel monetized. Now, there were a few things that delayed that progress, but none so much as an actual war. And while I had to take a long break, I must admit there was a point where I started to question whether the series was even really necessary anymore. Now, before you panic, let me tell you the short answer to that question is yes. Yes, very much so. We're going to get into that in another episode. But it is good to respond to some of the potential objections I've seen voiced in various places over the years and make a case for why such education is still needed. So the first objection, which is usually expressed in bad faith in the comments section of my original video, is basically denying that Wehraboo's are even a thing. As in, oh, are these Wehraboo's in the room with us now? This is a pretty easy claim to rebut. Just go on Twitter sometime. Once you've been made aware of what the term means, if you deny the existence of Wehraboo's, you're either not that into military history and related hobbies, or you are one and you're in denial. Here's the thing, the term may be relatively recent, but everyone who's been into military history or wargaming has encountered this type at least once. That guy who's just a little too obsessed with the Wehrmacht and consistently overrates everything about it. Except the war crimes, of course. Now, granted, most of these people tend to be young, and their fixation is often benign, often spurred by video games, documentaries, and mainstream dad history literature, all of which are still rife with outdated or oversimplified Wehraboo lore. And in certain hobbies, let's be honest, some participants may be just a little on the spectrum, and in such cases, the encyclopedic knowledge of German weaponry may not signify anything beyond a superficial obsession, no different from those about trains or civilian aviation. Look, even I'll admit I have a weird fixation for small arms with unusual feed methods that only Italy can satisfy. I mean, have you ever really looked at the Breda Model 30 light machine gun? I mean, have you really looked at it? Seriously, what were they thinking with this thing? It's got a hinged magazine you load with giant 20-round stripper clips. Oh, and the extraction is particularly violent, so you know what that means. It's got an oiler. Seriously though, what I'm saying here is that those people definitely exist, but that most of them are at worst annoying and ignorant and not closet Nazis or something more sinister. That being said, it's really bad if the latter encounter the former and use their affinity as a way to expose them to political extremist propaganda. You know, like this stuff. Now, if you have somehow managed to avoid these people all your life and thus didn't know they existed until you encountered videos from myself or others, congratulations. But here's something I think a lot of people online would do well to remember. Are you ready for this? Are you truly ready? Because I'm about to hit you with some revolutionary knowledge here that is going to change your life. Here it goes. Just because you have not personally encountered or experienced something does not mean it's not a thing. Objective reality exists independent of your personal perceptions. Now, that's some life advice you can take to the bank. All right, having got that epiphany out of the way, let's talk about the main subject of this episode. So the question is the term Wehraboo overused? Has it lost its meaning? And it's kind of been inspired by a few videos I've seen, both by history YouTubers that I have quite a lot of respect for. The way one of them phrased it was something like this scenario. So there was a time when every amateur military history buff thought that the Tiger tank was the greatest tank on the battlefield in the Second World War. And then a number of people poked holes in this image, and the pendulum swung too far in the opposite direction. So if the Tiger was once overrated, now it's underrated, and if you point out that it was in fact a very well-designed tank in some ways, you're suddenly met with skepticism, suspicion, and possibly accusations of being a Wehraboo. And the other video that inspired this was one by a very good history YouTuber, Military History Visualized. He is certainly not a Wehraboo. His videos actually debunk a lot of the myths about the Wehrmacht and expose the clean Wehrmacht myth and other things we associate with that. But he had a video about an encounter where somebody was pointing out some rather uncontroversial fact about either the Wehrmacht itself or tactics or technology. I don't remember exactly which it was at this time, but that is irrelevant. And basically some people piled on and said, like, this is Wehraboo garbage. And as he explained further in this video, he said words to the effect that, when you try to portray the Wehrmacht as being like incompetent and absolute crap, you're actually insulting all the people, Americans, British, Red Army, and all the nations in between and the partisans. You're sort of insulting all of them and the sacrifices that they made and the proficiency that they developed to actually outfight the Wehrmacht and totally defeat it. Because contrary to the Wehraboo mythology, the Allies didn't just win because they had superior numbers or superior resources. After all, in the open years of the war, superior resources or numbers actually didn't do them much good. What happened was they learned, they adapted faster and better than the Wehrmacht could, and they overcame. And there are plenty of examples where the British or Commonwealth armies, where the U.S. Army, where the Red Army actually outfights the Wehrmacht at the tactical level, operational level, and obviously at the strategic level. And so to go back to that tank analogy, the point of highlighting these serious flaws in the engineering, or as I'm going to explain in the second Anti-Wehraboo episode, highlighting the flaws of the German command, is not to tell you that Tigers are junk and the German general staff was completely incompetent. What we have is a situation where for many decades things were lifted on a pedestal and the mythology was created around them. So what we're doing is we're bringing them down from the pedestal. We're bringing these things out of mythology and propaganda and into the real world. So if we make jokes about the first Panthers basically catching fire on their way from the railhead to the front lines, the message there isn't that the Panther was a completely junk tank. The message is that you have to balance things. I'll give you another example, and this is one that I've taken a lot of flack for. I have a feeling because many of the critics watched a certain YouTube video and just kind of bought it as complete gospel. And it's about the T-34, which I called the second best tank of the war, which I'm pretty sure in the end of that video, I made it very clear that to talk about the best tank of the war doesn't really make sense. It's not proper military history, but bear with me. So a lot of people have taken the view now that the T-34 was complete trash. Now, this is an example of that pendulum swinging, because for a long time, the documentaries, the video games, all portrayed the T-34 as this, like, way ahead of its time tank. And it shocked the Germans, and it had the sloped armor, and the 37mm tank rounds just bounced right off it. But even back in those days, you could look at the day-to-day activities in Operation Barbarossa, and you could see where the Red Army was using T-34 tanks, and you can see them having a lot of problems with them. And obviously the Germans were advancing pretty regularly. And so it's very clear that the presence of the T-34 was not exactly stopping the offensive. Now, in more recent years, the pendulum has swung in the opposite direction, and the new narrative is, well, the T-34 was crap because of all these various problems it had. So then why would I call it the second best tank of the war? Well, it's very simple. So if you look at the Soviet campaign from 1941 onwards, what was generally the workhorse of the Red Army's armored force? It was the T-34. So the tank that you keep using and you eventually win with is arguably a tank that is good enough for what you need. And this is the sort of thing that, and so getting back to the main topic, I think a huge problem that a certain generation has these days is that there's no concept of nuance. Everything has to be exactly one thing. Either the Tiger is the deadliest tank on the battlefield, or it was complete junk. Same with the T-34. And either the Wehrmacht was led by these super ahead of their time maneuver warfare geniuses, or they were incompetent idiots who couldn't do anything right except doing war crimes. And the point is, and I'm speaking mainly to the young people here, you cannot approach history in this way. If once you understand all this, I think it's easier to understand what the problem, especially what my problem is with the whole Wehraboo mythology. It's not like a significant number of people are going to watch some Netflix documentary about Rommel and suddenly become neo-Nazis. It's just that it's bad history. But it's equally bad history to take a term like Wehraboo and then apply it to literally anything that correctly points out that, yes, the Wehrmacht was a very effective fighting force. If they were not, they would not have lasted as long as they did. If you cannot handle nuance, if you cannot handle ambiguity, contradictions, history just isn't your field. But having said all that, is the term Wehraboo obsolete? Should we scrap it? I don't really think so. I think I understand the phenomenon we're seeing here. If you would permit me to digress a bit, here's a little fun fact about me. I hate the website TV Tropes. If you're not familiar with it, it's like a wiki-type site dedicated to cataloging what they call tropes, or what you might think of as cliches, in popular media. Many years ago, when I first encountered it, I found it somewhat amusing. It was kind of funny and maybe even a little helpful to see really famous cliches categorized under a new term and sometimes lampooned where they deserved it. But it didn't take long for me to notice that nearly everything a character could conceivably do in a story gets called a trope, complete with its own page on the website. It's as if an entire generation or two can no longer conceive of stories, but rather just collections of tropes to be dissected and neatly categorized. Emotional connection to the story? That's not how you enjoy art these days. No, you sit with your friends and you talk about all the tropes you spotted in the movie, because you're so much smarter than the writers and you totally know that Lord of the Rings didn't actually happen. Someone just made it all up from a bunch of tropes. Oh, and if you think for a second that I'm exaggerating here, please be aware that apparently on what they call Book Talk, there are supposed literary critics recommending and reviewing books based on what tropes they have in them. I have also heard that instead of synopsis that you normally see on the back of a book, there are actually books that just list the tropes they contain. But getting back to TV tropes, it's not hard to see how something like that could happen in an open format wiki-style site. People, some of which might have actual writing experience, make funny, insightful pages about real cliches, like the kind people in the industry actually talk about. And people who enjoy reading those suddenly want to come up with their own tropes so they can get in on the action. Repeat that for a few years and you're going to wind up with the villain wears a hat trope, or the characters are breathing trope. But let's look at a term that's more accepted as a real cliche, one which was coined by a screenwriter who worked with the venerable Alfred Hitchcock, not millennial pop culture nerds. The term is MacGuffin. Traditionally, it refers to a plot device that drives the characters but may have little value to the audience, and this is a key part, is typically not described in detail. Its value may be vaguely explained, if at all. So, the briefcase in Pulp Fiction, MacGuffin. On Obtainium and Avatar, we know it's valuable, but we're never told what it's used for or why, so MacGuffin. Over time, however, I began to hear the term MacGuffin get applied to things like the spice from Dune. The spice, dear viewer, is not a MacGuffin. Whether in the book, the 1984 David Lynch masterpiece, or the Denis Villeneuve double masterpiece, the importance of the spice is made pretty clear to the viewer. It expands consciousness, it extends life, it is even used like regular spice in food because it tastes good apparently. But more important than any of that, it makes faster than light space travel possible, and thus it is the basis for the entire empire and human civilization in the known universe. That the audience does not know the exact mechanism by which the spice does these various things is immaterial. The audience consumes all kinds of drugs every day without understanding how they assuage their pain or get them high as balls. What matters is the reasons for the spice's value, and therefore the character's motives are adequately explained, and therefore the spice is not a MacGuffin. I'm sorry to go off on a tangent, but I think this illustrates the manner by which words like Wehraboo, especially in online spaces, can get abused, and thus it seems like they might lose their meaning. But just because not every physical item characters fight over is a MacGuffin, and not every happy-go-lucky female love interest is a manic pixie dream girl, it doesn't mean those cliches lose all meaning. The same goes for Wehraboo. Just because some people abuse it, usually because they just heard it and it sounds funny and cool, doesn't mean it's not a thing, or it's not a thing we shouldn't try to counteract. And I do really think we should counteract it because, let's be frank, military history and broader society has kind of a bad rap. It's associated with socially awkward nerds of questionable hygiene standards, sociopaths obsessed with violence, man-children, or just combinations of all of those. And let's be honest, if you're into the topic, you've encountered these people at one time or another. Nowadays, there's even a joke, often made by women, that when a guy says he's a history buff or really into history, it almost certainly means he's either into ancient Rome or the German military in the Second World War. How did it get this reputation? I think there are many factors, but one of the biggest is the outdated approach to military history that focuses on things like battles, commanders, and weapons and technology. This is the kind of material that we think of when we say things like dad history, and popular military history is arguably the main pillar of dad history. But let me say something a little provocative for a moment. And I'm saying this because the media keeps telling me that young men in my country are lost and need advice. So here's my 2 cents, and at least I'm not trying to sell you some phony self-help book or supplements in the process. If your idea of military history is memorizing dates and events of battles, unit designations, technical specs of weapons, and so on, you're not really doing military history. What you're doing is wargaming. You could take all that encyclopedic knowledge of whatever historical battle you're obsessed with and replace it with the same type of knowledge for a totally fictional battle like Istvan V during the Horus Heresy in the 40K universe. That's not to say don't study stuff that interests you, just don't mistake that for military history. Military history to me is when you study questions like why did a certain country or leader win a string of major decisive battles and then totally lose the war they were waging. It's when you don't just obsess over the features of some weapon system or vehicle and start thinking about the society and the economic policies that produce them, or more importantly, produce them in sufficient or perhaps insufficient quantities. It's when, instead of obsessing over supposedly genius commanders and their most famous battles, you study the doctrines they were brought up in and how those tactics evolved or failed to evolve over time. As Clausewitz said, war is politics by other means, so the study of war also means the study of politics and the history of the countries involved. If you're explaining the First World War's origins with a story about an Archduke's driver taking a wrong turn in Sarajevo, you haven't even scratched the surface. You want to know how an always hustling Sigma military history buff explains the First World War? You take that shit all the way back to the Crimean War. Hell, You want to understand anything on the continent of Europe in the first half of the 20th century, you better start with the springtime of the peoples in 1848. That chaotic period explains so much about the way our world is even today. I'm not telling you you've got to stop playing Hearts of Iron 4. Okay, actually, yes, I think I might tell you to stop. What I mean is you can still play your war games, reenact, or stack those sweet Osprey books. There's nothing wrong with that. But if you really want to understand, broaden your horizons. Understand the world in which these things existed and happened. If anything, it will only help you appreciate those little uniform details you love to obsess over. I'm not telling you to stop reading about one thing. I'm saying read more, study more. Hell, start with baby steps and study a conflict you previously knew nothing about involving countries you know nothing about. If you're one of my people, an American, that means you've got a long list to choose from. Immerse yourself in an era and understand the politics, the culture, the art, the literature. Guarantee you'll have a much easier time socializing at parties if you can discuss something like the Dadaist art movement or Hemingway, as well as you could talk about the variations of different tank models. And that's why we need to keep fighting back against phenomena like Wehrabooism and related mindsets. Not only because of the political or moral implications, but also because it's just plain bad history that keeps people from maturing beyond the level of a hobbyist. I think it's great that we live in a time with such unprecedented access to information, when archives have been opened, language barriers are coming down, and historical topics are a common feature of popular entertainment. I don't think there's ever been more opportunity and accessibility for someone who gets interested in history because of a video game and wants to actually learn about the events depicted and their causes. The only thing that can throw a wrench into the works is outdated, long debunked mythology. And that's why I'm continuing this work as best I can, given the circumstances. So, thank you for listening to my unhinged rants once again. I ask you to, as always, click like and subscribe and check out the description below to see how you can support my work via Patreon. Every once in a while, I drop some exclusive audio logs in there and bits and pieces of other stuff, behind the scenes type stuff. And I like to answer questions from the patrons from time to time. A lot of fun. So, I hope you enjoyed this, and I will catch you next time.